I have lived long enough to know that the truth has a way of surfacing on its own. You cannot bury it forever. You can pile things on top of it, layer after layer of silence and smiles and Sunday phone calls, but it will find a crack eventually. It always does. I've thought about this a great deal over the past few years, sitting in this old chair by the window, watching the neighborhood go quiet in the evenings, watching the light change on the walls of this small house that used to feel like more than it does now. I've had a lot of time to think. Too much, maybe. When a man gets to my age and the days stretch out long and still, thinking becomes the thing you do most. And I've thought about my son. I've thought about what it means to be a father and what it means to be proud, and whether those two things can exist at the same time without one of them being a kind of lie. My name is not important. What is important is that I am 73 years old, and I live in the house I have lived in for the past 31 years. It is a modest house on a modest street, 2 bedrooms, one of which I stopped using after my wife Margaret passed. The roof has needed work for going on 4 years now, and there's a section of the back porch where the wood has gone soft, and I step around it the way you learn to step around the tender places in your own life. The furnace is old. The kitchen faucet has had a slow drip since winter that I have patched twice with washers from the hardware store, and both times it held for a week and then started again. I do not tell people these things. It is not in my nature to speak about what I lack. My mother raised me in a house where you managed, and you did not burden others with your managing. That was simply the way of it. My son is named Daniel. He is 44 years old, and he is, by any measure that the world cares about, a remarkable success. He built a software company in his early 30s from what started as a converted garage and a great deal of stubbornness, and by the time he sold it 7 years later, he had made more money than I could have imagined earning in 10 lifetimes. He did not stop there. He invested. He started another company. He sits on boards. He travels in ways I have only seen in magazines, to places with names I have to look up on the map that is still pinned to the inside of my pantry door from when Daniel was in school and used to ask me where things were. He lives with his wife Clara in a house that has a name, not a street address, a name. Ashford Estates, they call it. I have been there 4 times. Each time I walk through the front door, I feel something I cannot quite name, something between wonder and a mild, persistent embarrassment at my own shoes. Clara is Daniel's wife of 12 years. She is a composed woman, elegant in a way that seems effortless and probably is not. She has dark hair that she wears pinned up, and she dresses in the way of people who have learned to use clothing as a statement rather than simply as warmth. She was always pleasant to me. That is the word I would choose. Pleasant, not warm in the way that Margaret was warm, not the kind of warmth that draws you in and makes you feel that you belong somewhere. Pleasant. Cordial. She remembered my birthday every year with a card, always a beautiful card, and she would kiss my cheek when she arrived and when she left, and she would ask me polite questions about the neighborhood and the weather and how my hip was doing. I never had any reason to doubt her. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I never had any reason. Daniel called me on a Thursday afternoon in early June to tell me he was coming for Father's Day. He said he wanted to make a real day of it, come early, bring lunch, spend the afternoon. I could hear in his voice that he meant it, that mixture of warmth and slight guilt that adult children carry when they know they have not visited enough. I told him I would look forward to it, which was true. I did look forward to it. I always look forward to seeing my son. I put the phone down, and I stood in the kitchen for a moment, and I thought about how I would tidy the house and whether I should bake something. I used to bake. Margaret was the baker, but I'd learned a few things from her, and there was a time when Daniel would call ahead and ask specifically for the walnut cake. I decided I would try to make the walnut cake. It seemed like the right gesture for the day. The week before Father's Day, I had been to see Father Ronaldo at St. Anthony's on the corner of Millbrook and 5th. I have gone to that church for 22 years, and Father Ronaldo has been there for the last 9. He is a patient man, unhurried in the way of someone who has genuinely made peace with how long things take. I had gone to him 2 months earlier during a period when things had gotten quite tight. My pension comes in, and it is enough for the basics if you are careful, But there had been a water heater in February that was not optional, and a prescription that the insurance had stopped covering without explanation. And by March I had found myself in a situation I had not been in since Daniel was a small boy and we were stretching a single income over a family's worth of needs. I am not a proud man in the way that makes pride destructive, but I'm a private man, and going to Father Ronaldo with my hat in my hand was one of the harder things I had done in recent memory. He had not made it difficult. That is the thing about Father Ronaldo. He had a fund, he told me, from parish donations specifically for situations like this. He had helped me with the grocery bill in March and then again in April when the property tax bill came in higher than I had been expecting. He had also connected me with a woman from the parish named Mrs. Gutierrez, who brought meals on Wednesdays and Fridays, which I had accepted after a small interior argument with myself about what it meant to accept such things. I had convinced myself that accepting gracefully was its own form of dignity. I was still not entirely sure I believed that. I had not told Daniel any of this. The thought had not even seriously presented itself to me as an option. Daniel had his life, his enormous, complicated, successful life, and the last thing I wanted was to become a problem in it. I was his father. I was supposed to have things managed. So when he called, I told him things were fine. I always told him things were fine. And he, in the way of a son who wants to believe his father is fine, always accepted this. Father's Day arrived with the kind of gentle warmth that June can offer when it is feeling generous. I had cleaned the house the 2 days before, not frantically but steadily, moving through each room with the methodical attention of someone who wants to present themselves with some measure of decency. I had vacuumed the living room rug that was beginning to show its age around the edges, and I had polished the small table by the window where Margaret's photograph still sits. I had made the walnut cake on Saturday, and it had come out well, better than I expected, and I had felt a small, uncomplicated happiness about this that I held on to. I set it on the kitchen counter under the glass dome and told myself the day was going to be a good one. Daniel arrived at 11 in the morning. I heard his car in the driveway, which is easy to hear because it is a very quiet car, the kind of quiet that itself is a form of expense, a deep engineered silence that ordinary cars do not have. I was at the door before he'd come up the front walk. He looked good. He always looks good, my son. He has Margaret's eyes and my jawline, and somewhere between the two of them he became a handsome man, which I can say without it sounding like vanity because I have never taken credit for what nature and his mother's genetics accomplished. He was wearing a light jacket and he was carrying 2 bags from a restaurant I recognized as being one of the better ones in town. And when he saw me at the door, his face opened up in the smile that still, even now, even at his age, looks exactly like the smile he had at 7 years old, and I felt the familiar compression in my chest that I have come to understand is simply what love feels like when it has nowhere to go. He hugged me at the door, a real hug, the kind that lasts more than a second, and he held me for a moment and said, "Happy Father's Day, Dad." And I said the same to him in the way that doesn't quite make sense but that fathers say anyway, and we laughed at that the way we always do, and it was good. It was genuinely good. We went inside, and he set the bags on the kitchen counter, and he noticed the walnut cake immediately. He turned around and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as a kind of moved surprise, and he said, "You made the cake?" And I said, "Your mother's recipe." And he nodded slowly and did not say anything else for a moment, and neither did I. Clara was not with him. He had come alone, which I noticed but did not remark upon. She had come on previous Father's Day visits, and her absence was not unusual enough to require comment. I assumed she had her own obligations, her family or a social engagement, something in that large, carefully organized life of hers. I did not think about it much beyond that. I was glad to have Daniel to myself, if I am honest. Our conversations were different when it was just the two of us, easier, less performed. We sat at the kitchen table and ate the food he had brought, which was very good, though I will say that good food in those containers always carries a slight melancholy with it, the suggestion of a restaurant experience translated imperfectly into an ordinary kitchen. But we talked well. We talked about his work, which I never entirely understand but which I always listen to carefully, because the texture of his voice when he talks about it tells me things about who he is that the words themselves do not. We talked about the neighborhood, about the Garcias 2 houses down who had just had a grandchild, about the linden tree on the corner that the city had finally come and trimmed after 3 years of requests. We talked about Daniel's daughter, Sophie, my granddaughter, who is 11 and who FaceTimes me on Saturday mornings sometimes to show me things she has drawn. I love Sophie with a depth that still surprises me. Children have a way of reopening parts of you that you thought had closed. After we had eaten and the table was cleared, we moved to the living room. Daniel sat on the sofa and I sat in my chair, and we had coffee, and there was the comfortable silence of people who know each other well enough not to need to fill every moment. The afternoon light was coming in through the front window, falling in long rectangles across the floor, and outside, a lawnmower was going somewhere on the street, and it was one of those moments that you recognize even while it is happening as the kind of moment you will remember afterward. It was in this comfortable, unhurried moment that Daniel set down his coffee cup and looked at me with an expression that I recognized as the preamble to something he had been working up to saying. He has always had this quality, my son. He is direct in his professional life, I am told, decisive and clear. But with me, he approaches things the way you approach a horse you are not sure about, carefully, without sudden movements. He learned this from watching how I communicated with his mother, I think. Or perhaps it is simply the way sons learn to talk to fathers when there is love, and a history of inadequate expression between them. He said, "Dad, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be straight with me." I said, "I am always straight with you, Daniel," which was not entirely true, but which was true in the ways that mattered to me. He nodded. He said, "Are you happy with the $5,000 Clara sends you every month?" I want to make sure it's enough. I've been thinking lately that it might not be enough, with prices the way they are, and I wanted to talk to you about it. I want to describe carefully what happened inside me in the moment after he said this, because it is important, and because if I do not describe it carefully, you might think it was simpler than it was. It was not simple. It was not a single thing. It was a set of things arriving all at once, the way a wave is not a water molecule, but the movement of millions of them together. There was confusion, first and most prominently. Confusion of the purest kind, the kind that is not yet alarmed, but is simply trying to locate itself on a map that does not seem to have the right landmarks. $5,000 a month. Clara sends you. Every month. I turn the words over the way you turn a stone over, looking at the underside, trying to understand what you are looking at. I said nothing for what must have been several seconds. Daniel was watching me. I was aware of him watching me. I was aware of the clock on the mantel and the lawnmower outside and the particular quality of the afternoon light. All of this with the heightened clarity of a moment in which something is shifting beneath you and you have not yet understood what it is. I said, "I'm sorry." He said, "The money, Dad. The $5,000 a month I've been sending you. Clara handles the transfer. She's been doing it for, 3 years, maybe a little longer. I just want to make sure it's actually making things easier for you." I looked at my son. I looked at the face that I have known since before it was capable of expression, the face I watched learn everything a face learns, joy and disappointment and the complicated feelings that come later. And I made a decision in that moment, not a reasoned decision, but an instinctive one, the way you make the decisions that matter. I decided to tell him the truth. I said, "Daniel, I appreciate what you're saying. I appreciate that you think about me that way. But I need to tell you something, and I want you to let me finish before you say anything." I said, "The church has been helping me lately. Father Ronaldo. He has a fund for people who are in a tight spot, and I have been in a tight spot these past few months. I'm all right, I want you to know that, but I have been accepting help from the parish. The silence that followed this was different from the comfortable silence of before. It had weight to it. It had the quality of something that has been held back for a long time, finding its way into a room. Daniel said, very slowly, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean what I said. Things have been difficult. The water heater in February. The prescription that the insurance stopped covering. I managed. You know I manage. But I have been grateful for the parish's help. He said, "But Dad, the $5,000 a month." I looked at him steadily. I said, "Daniel, I don't know what $5,000 a month you're talking about. I have not received $5,000 a month from anyone. I have not received $5,000 in total from anyone in longer than I can tell you." He stared at me. I watched his face do the thing that faces do when the world they were standing on turns out to have been standing on something else. I watched the confusion, and then I watched something harder move in behind the confusion, and I recognized it because I have seen it in him before, in moments when his fundamental fairness has collided with something that is not fair. It is a quality I have always been proud of in him, the inability to make peace with injustice. He said, "That's not possible." I said, "I understand that's what you believe, but I'm telling you what is true." He picked up his phone. I watched him dial, watched him hold the phone to his ear, watched his jaw tighten slightly as it rang. Then I heard his voice, quiet and controlled in the way of someone maintaining control through deliberate effort, and he said, "Clara, I need you to come over. Right now." "Yes, to my father's house." "I know. I'll explain when you get here." He put the phone down. He did not look at me immediately, and I did not push. I looked out the window at the street. The lawnmower had stopped. A boy on a bicycle was going past, slowly, the way boys on bicycles go past when they are not going anywhere in particular. I thought, without meaning to, of Daniel at that age, when he had a blue bicycle with a dent in the fender from a fall that had frightened me more than it frightened him. Daniel said, "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that whatever you tell me, I am not going to be upset with you." I said, "You can ask me anything," he said. "Has there ever been a time, any time in the last 3 or 4 years, when you received a wire transfer or a bank deposit from Clara, or from me through her?" I said, "No. The only money that comes into my account regularly is my pension. There have been occasional small things, birthday cards with a check, that sort of thing, but nothing regular. Nothing even close to what you're describing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And you didn't say anything. When things got difficult, you didn't tell me." I said, "You have your own life, Daniel." He made a sound that was not quite a word. He stood up from the sofa and walked to the window and stood there with his back to me for a moment, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, in the way he held himself. I recognized the posture. It was the posture of a man who was trying to contain something large. He turned around and he said, "I have been sending you that money every month for over 3 years. I set it up right after the time I came to visit and noticed that the roof was looking rough. I set it up and I asked Clara to manage it because she handles our finances, all of it, the accounts, the transfers, everything. And she told me she was doing it. Every month when I asked, she told me it was done. She told me you were grateful, that you didn't make a big deal about it, but that you appreciated it." I let this settle for a moment. I thought about what it meant. Over 3 years, 12 months in a year, $5,000 each month. I am not a fast mathematician, but you do not need to be fast to understand what that number becomes over that many months, what that sum of money represents. I thought about Father Rinaldo and Mrs. Gutierrez, and the soft section of the back porch and the dripping kitchen faucet. I thought about the prescription I had not refilled in full because I could not afford to, taking half doses for 2 months, telling myself it was probably fine. I said, "Daniel, I think you need to wait for Clara to get here before we talk about this any further." He nodded. He sat back down. We did not talk for a while. We sat in the living room of my small house on Father's Day afternoon, and we each occupied our own silence, and outside the neighborhood went about its ordinary Sunday business, and the clock on the mantel measured the time between the world, as Daniel had believed it to be, and the world as it apparently was. She arrived 40 minutes later. I heard the car first, and then the door, and then her heels on the front walk, a precise, measured sound. Daniel had gotten up when she called to say she was close, and he let her in at the door, and I heard his voice in the entryway, low and careful, and then I heard hers, confused, asking what this was about, what had happened. Was his father all right? There was a pause. Then they came into the living room together. Clara was dressed as she always is, put together in a way that under other circumstances I might have admired. She wore a blouse the color of pale sea glass and dark trousers, and her hair was up, and she looked composed, which is her natural state. She looked at me and she said, "Harold, is everything all right?" Her voice had the right note of concern in it. She sat down on the sofa next to Daniel, and she reached over and put her hand briefly on his knee, an automatic gesture, the kind you make after 12 years of marriage without thinking about it. Daniel said, "I want to ask you something, Clara, and I need you to answer me honestly." She looked at him. Something very slight moved through her expression, something too small and too quick to name, like a fish in dark water. She said, "Of course." "What is it?" He said, "The money I asked you to transfer to my father every month, the $5,000. She said, "Yes, of course." He said, "Clara, has that money been going to my father?" She looked at him. Then she looked at me. The composure was still there, but it was doing more work now. You could see it from the outside if you knew what composed effort looked like, which I do, having practiced it myself for a great many years. She said, "What are you asking me, Daniel?" He said, "I'm asking you directly. I'm asking you to look at me and tell me whether that money has been transferred to my father's account every month as I asked." She said, "Why would you even ask something like that?" "Of course it has," I said, gently but clearly. "Clara, it has not." She looked at me then, and I want to say something about that moment, about the way she looked at me, because it is important. She looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as a kind of recalibration. Not guilt exactly, or not yet. More like someone who has suddenly understood that the situation they have been managing has changed in a fundamental way, and they need to understand the new parameters before they decide how to proceed. It was a look I had never seen on her face before, in all the years of cordial kisses on the cheek and polite questions about my hip. It was a look that told me something about who she was, and in that look I understood certain things that I had simply not understood before. She said, "Harold, I think there may have been some confusion about which account. I've been dealing with a lot of accounts and there might have been a mix-up." Daniel said, "Clara," she said, "I can check. I'll call the bank on Monday and we can clear this up." Daniel said, "I want to look at it right now." She said, "Daniel, this is not the time or place to be going through financial records." He said, "Clara, look me in the eye and tell me you have been sending my father $5,000 every month for the last 3 years. The silence that came after this was the longest silence I've experienced in recent memory. It was the kind of silence that has texture to it, that you can feel on your skin. Clara sat very still on the sofa, and I saw her hands in her lap, and I noticed that her right hand was pressing against the fabric of her trousers with a slow, steady pressure, the only visible sign of anything happening beneath the surface. Then, something in her seemed to make a decision. I saw it happen. I have seen it happen in other people, in other difficult moments, the moment when the energy required to maintain the construction becomes greater than the energy available to maintain it. She looked at Daniel, and then she looked at her hands, and then she looked at Daniel again, and she said, "I was going to put it back. I want you to know that." The room was very still. Outside a car passed. The clock on the mantel ticked through several seconds. Daniel said, "What did you just say?" She said, "I was going to put it back. It started as just a few months. I had some expenses that I couldn't explain to you, some things I had gotten into that I was embarrassed about, and I thought I would borrow it temporarily and replace it before you noticed." She paused, and then it became easier to keep doing it than to fix it. I told myself Harold had his pension, that he was managing, that I would put it right eventually. I told myself he wasn't suffering. I listened to this with a stillness that I think surprised even myself, because what I felt in that moment was not rage, exactly, though there was something in the range of rage present. What I felt most prominently was a kind of clarifying sadness, the sadness of understanding something about the world that you had preferred not to understand. I thought about the water heater in February. I thought about Father Ronaldo sitting across the desk from me with his unhurried patience while I explained my situation, and the particular quality of that conversation, the careful generosity of it, and how I had walked home from that meeting with the strange combination of relief and shame that charity produces in people who were raised not to need it. I thought about all the phone calls with Daniel over those 3 years, his regular checking in, his careful questions about how I was doing, his cheerful assumption that things were comfortable. I'd always said, fine, yes, doing well, don't worry about me. I'd always said that. But I had said it believing that I was protecting him from worry, not believing that I was the only thing standing between the truth and a deception his own wife was perpetrating. Daniel stood up from the sofa. He moved to the far side of the room, which is not very far in this living room, and he stood there with his back to us for a moment, and I watched the muscles in his neck and jaw, and I thought, very clearly, that this was going to be one of the hardest things he would carry for a very long time. Not just the betrayal, but the specific nature of it, the way it implicated his love for me, the way it meant that while he had believed himself to be a good son who took care of his father had been accepting charity from a parish fund. That is the part that will stay with him. I know my son. He turned around. His voice when he spoke was very quiet, which in Daniel is far more serious than volume. He said, "Clara, I need you to understand something. I need you to understand what you have done." She said, "Daniel, I know I was wrong." He said, "Do you? Do you actually know what you were doing? My father has been struggling. He has been accepting help from his church. He has been managing on his own while you told me every month that the money was going to him. You looked me in the eye. I asked you more than once, and you looked me in the eye." She said, "I know." He said, "And you told him that you were grateful for him. When I asked, you told me he appreciated the money, that he didn't make a fuss about it. You invented his gratitude. You invented his response." I looked at Clara, and she was looking at her hands again, and I noticed that the composure that is her most reliable feature was not entirely available to her in this moment. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in some other way, in the way of someone whose carefully maintained projection of themselves has come apart in a room, and what is left is just a person, flawed and frightened and sorry, though whether sorry for the act or sorry for the exposure, I could not entirely tell. I said, "Clara, I want to ask you something." She looked at me, and there was something in her look that I was not expecting. There was something that looked very close to genuine distress. Not performed distress, but the real thing, the kind that lives behind the eyes. I said, "The expenses you mentioned, the things you were embarrassed about. What were they?" Daniel looked at me with some surprise at this. Clara looked at me too, with a different kind of surprise. She said, "Harold, that isn't really relevant." I said, "I think it might be. I'm not asking to excuse what you did. I'm asking because I'm an old man, and I have learned that people do not do things like this for no reason, and the reason matters. Not for the action, but for understanding what happened." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "There were some debts, from before Daniel and I got together, old credit debts that I had never fully resolved and that had grown substantially. I was embarrassed about them, and I didn't want Daniel to know about them when we got married. And then after we were married, it seemed impossible to tell him. And then more time passed." She stopped. She said, "I know how that sounds." I said, "It sounds like someone who made one bad choice and then spent years trying to manage the consequences of it, and in the process made a great many more bad choices. That is a very human thing to do. That does not make it acceptable. But I want you to hear me say that I understand how those things happen." Daniel said, "Dad?" I said, "I'm not defending her, Daniel. What she did caused me real difficulty, and it was a serious wrong. And you need to address it in whatever way you need to address it. I'm speaking to her as a person who has also made bad choices and had to live with them. That is all." Clara looked at me with an expression that I did not know how to name entirely. There was something in it that might have been, in different circumstances, something approaching respect. Daniel pulled out his phone again. He said, "I'm going to look at the transfers right now." He was quiet while he scrolled, and I watched his face while he read whatever he was reading. And I watched it do several things in quick succession, things I will not try to fully describe because they belong to him and not to me. He said, 3 years and 4 months. He said it flatly, like a measurement, like a length of lumber. He said, "Over $200,000. Nobody spoke for a moment. He said, "Clara, I need you to go home. I need to spend time with my father today, which is what I came here to do, and then I need to think very carefully about what happens next." He said it without cruelty, but without softness either, and I recognized in his voice the particular register of someone who has passed through the hot part of something and arrived at the cold part, which is in some ways the more dangerous. She stood. She looked at me. She said, "Harold, I am sorry." She said it simply, without decoration, and I believed it was true as far as it went. I said, "I know you are." She left. We heard the car. Daniel came and sat back down on the sofa, and he put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he stayed that way for a while, and I let him stay that way, because sometimes the most useful thing another person can offer is simply to remain present and not require anything. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red at the edges. He said, "Dad, I'm so sorry." I said, "You have nothing to be sorry for." He said, "I should have checked. I should have verified. I just trusted. I just assumed." I said, "That is not a flaw, Daniel. Trusting the person you married is not a flaw." He said, "You were going to the church for groceries." He said this last word as though it had a weight attached to it, as though saying it put something in his hands that he needed to decide what to do with. I said, "Yes." He said, "And you never told me. All those phone calls." I said, "I was protecting you." He said, "From what?" I thought about this. I said, "From worrying. From the particular kind of worry that children have about their parents, which is different from other kinds of worry because it runs in both directions. Because when you're worried about your parents, you are also, underneath it, worried about yourself, about what it means for you that they are struggling, about what it means that the people who represented solidity and provision have become something else. I didn't want to put that on you. I wanted to be your father, not your problem." He looked at me for a long time. He said, "You are not a problem, Dad. You are never a problem. You are my father, which is the most important thing. And I need you to understand that there is nothing you could need from me that I would not want to give you." I said, "I know that. In my heart, I have always known that." He said, "Then why?" I said, "Because knowing something in your heart and knowing how to act on it without feeling that you have diminished yourself are two different things. I am from a different time, Daniel. In my time, a man managed his own affairs. Accepting help meant something about you that you did not want it to mean. I know that is not rational, and I know the world does not see it that way. But it is inside me, this thing, and I cannot entirely reason it out of myself even when I try." He nodded. He understood this, I think, in the way that children understand things about their parents, that they cannot fully share from the inside, but that they can recognize from the outside, the way you recognize a landscape from an airplane that you could not navigate from the ground. We sat together for a while in the quiet of the afternoon. The light had moved. It was later than it had been. The cake was still in the kitchen under its dome, and after some time had passed, Daniel got up and said, "I think we should have some of that cake." And I said I thought so too, and I went and cut 2 pieces and brought them to the living room on the plates that Margaret had picked out, white with a blue ring around the rim, and we ate the cake sitting across from each other, and he told me it was the best thing he had eaten in months, which I did not believe, but which I appreciated very much. He stayed until early evening. Before he left, we sat at the kitchen table, and he opened an application on his phone, and he set up a direct transfer, not through Clara, directly from his account to mine, and he told me the amount, and I told him it was too much, and he looked at me in a particular way, patient and firm in equal measure, and I stopped arguing. He said, "I'm going to come back next weekend, and we're going to look at the house together, the roof and whatever else needs doing." I said, "The back porch as well," and he wrote it down. When he left, we stood on the front walk in the early evening light, the air gentle and warm, and he held me again the way he had at the door when he arrived, and this time it lasted even longer, and I held him back, my son, my 44-year-old son who was still in some permanent way the small boy who had a blue bicycle with a dent in the fender. He said, "I'll call you tonight." I said, "I'll be up." He got in his quiet car and drove away, and I stood on the front walk for a moment after his taillights had turned the corner at the end of the street. The neighborhood was its usual gentle evening self. Somewhere a dog was barking, the mild, sociable bark of a dog that wants to be noticed rather than a dog that is alarmed. Mrs. Petrakis next door was watering her window boxes. She waved at me, and I waved back. I went inside and I washed the plates. I washed them the way I wash everything, carefully, with attention, taking my time, the way Margaret taught me when we were first married, and I was still the kind of young man who considered washing dishes an imposition rather than a task with its own small dignity. I dried them and put them back in the cabinet, the white plates with the blue ring. I thought about Clara. I thought about her sitting in their large named house that evening, in whatever room she chose to occupy with the knowledge of what had happened that afternoon, and I thought about what that would feel like, and I found that I did not feel the anger toward her that perhaps I was entitled to feel. What I felt was something more complicated, something closer to pity, though not the pity that diminishes a person. The pity that recognizes in another person the particular suffering of someone who has told one lie and then found that the only way to sustain it was to build another one on top of it and another on top of that until the structure has grown so large that dismantling it seems impossible. I know something about that kind of suffering, though I have lived my version of it on a smaller scale. I thought about what Daniel would do, and I knew he would do something. I knew him well enough to know that this would not pass without consequence. But what form the consequence would take was not something I could see clearly, and it was not mine to determine. That was between them. I had my own life to return to, such as it was, and it would be a somewhat easier life going forward than it had been, and that was something to hold on to. I sat in my chair by the window as the evening came fully in. I thought about Margaret. I thought about how she would have responded to this day, what she would have said, and I could hear her voice clearly in the way that I can still hear it after 6 years, the particular cadence of her, the way she had of locating the essential thing in a situation and naming it simply. She would have said something about truth eventually finding its way out. She would have said it not as comfort exactly, but as observation, the way she noted things about the world that she had found to be reliably true. And she would have been right, as she usually was. I have lived long enough to know that the truth has a way of surfacing on its own. You cannot bury it forever. I thought I knew what that meant before today. I think I understand it somewhat better now. Not just the truth about what Clara had been doing, but the other truth as well, the one I had been burying with my own particular form of pride. The truth that I needed help. The truth that accepting help from the people who love you is not diminishment, but is in fact its own form of trust, and that trust, offered and received honestly, is one of the better things two people can do for each other. Father Ronaldo would be pleased if I told him this. He has said as much to me in his roundabout way. I think I will go and see him this week. Not to return anything, not yet, though in time there will be something to return. Just to sit with him for a while in his unhurried way and tell him that things have clarified somewhat, and that I am grateful for his patience with a stubborn old man who took too long to ask for what he needed. Daniel called at 9 o'clock that night, as he said he would. He said, "How are you doing, Dad?" I said I was well. He said, "I want you to know that I've spoken to Clara and we're going to work through this, but I need you to know that your situation, what you need, is not going to be affected by whatever happens between Clara and me." "That is settled." I said, "I know, Daniel." He said, "Also, Sophie wants to know if you can FaceTime this Saturday because she made something she wants to show you." I said, "Saturday morning I will be sitting right here." We said goodnight. I sat for a while longer in my chair, in my small house, in the quiet of a Father's Day evening that had been many things at once, difficult and clarifying, and in the end, what I think I would have to call good. Not good because it was easy. Good because it was honest. There is a difference between those two things that I have come to appreciate more and more as the years have accumulated. The cake was still under its glass dome on the kitchen counter, most of it still remaining, the walnut smell of it faint in the air. I cut one more small piece before I went to bed. I stood at the counter and ate it slowly, tasting it carefully, recognizing the way it was not quite as good as Margaret's had been, but very close, Close enough that the difference was only something you could detect if you had been eating her version for decades, and that kind of closeness, I have found, is often the most honest kind of tribute that love can pay. I turned off the kitchen light and I went to my bedroom, and I pulled back the covers that I had ironed the day before in preparation for the visit, for reasons I could not entirely explain, except that it is the kind of thing I do, the kind of small, invisible effort that no one sees but that you know about yourself, and knowing about it is the point. I lay down, and I listened to the house settle around me, its old familiar language of clicks and creaks, the conversation that a house has with the night when it has been long enough inhabited to know how. Outside, a soft wind was moving through the linden tree at the corner. I could hear it, just barely. Through the window I keep cracked regardless of the season, a habit from childhood that I have never abandoned. I thought of my son driving home through the nighttime streets to his large house with its name, carrying with him the difficult knowledge of the day. I thought of Clara in some room of that house with her own knowledge. I thought of Sophie, already asleep probably, her drawings on her desk, her 11-year-old certainty that she would show her grandfather something wonderful on Saturday. And I thought that what had happened today was not simply an exposure, not simply the undoing of a lie, though it was both of those things. What had happened today was a restoration, something that had been quietly stolen, not just money, but the connection it was meant to represent, the particular care between a parent and a child that expresses itself in the willingness to provide and the willingness to receive, that whole honest economy of love, had been restored. Not all at once, not without damage, but restored nonetheless. I am 73 years old. I've buried a wife and a way of life and a great many certainties that I once held about how things work. I've learned, slowly and sometimes at significant cost, that dignity is not the same thing as pride, that strength is not the same thing as silence, and that the people who love you are owed the truth of your circumstances in the same way that you owe them the truth of your heart. I closed my eyes. Through the window, the linden tree went on talking to the night in its ancient, unhurried way. And somewhere in the neighborhood, the mild, sociable dog was quiet at last, and the street was still, and I slept.